Content warning. This video discusses American slavery, forced labor, and the ongoing theft of cultural and intellectual property. Most people think American cuisine evolved naturally, different cultures blending over time, a melting pot of flavors developing organically. That's not wrong. It's just incomplete. And when the cookbooks came out, when the restaurants opened, when the brands got built, when Southern cooking became marketable American cuisine, their names didn't appear. Their contributions got reassigned to white plantation mistresses. Their expertise became someone else's heritage. Their innovations became traditional without attribution. The authors? White plantation mistresses who supervised kitchens but rarely cooked in them. The actual cooks who created these recipes, who developed these techniques, who perfected these dishes through years of daily practice. Unnamed, uncompensated, legally unable to object, systematically erased. This wasn't oversight. This was system. This was how intellectual property theft worked when the people creating the property couldn't legally own anything, including themselves. Today, we're breaking down how American cuisine was shaped in enslaved kitchens and how history conveniently forgot the chefs. Enslaved cooks ran plantation kitchens, not assisted in them, not worked under supervision, ran them. High status position within the enslaved hierarchy, trusted with expensive ingredients, with feeding important guests, with maintaining the enslaver's reputation, but zero autonomy over their own lives, their own families, their own futures. If you ate at George Washington's table, if you dined at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, if you attended a plantation dinner anywhere in the South from the 1700s through the 1860s, you were eating food prepared by people who were legally property, whose children could be sold away from them, who could be beaten, raped, killed without legal consequence. Hercules, Washington's chef, had become so skilled that Washington allowed him to sell leftover scraps from the kitchen. Bones, fat, vegetable trimmings. Hercules made money, bought nice clothes, walked around Philadelphia with the confidence and bearing of a man whose talent was undeniable, whose skills were irreplaceable. But he was still enslaved, still could be sold, still property. And when Washington prepared to leave Philadelphia and return to Virginia in 1797, Hercules understood what that meant. Return to Mount Vernon, return to Virginia's harsher slave codes, return to plantation life instead of city semi-autonomy. So on February 22nd, 1797, Washington's birthday, Hercules escaped, walked away from the kitchen he'd run for years, chose freedom over prestige, over reputation, over everything. Washington sent ads, offered rewards. Hercules was never found, presumably lived the rest of his life as a free man somewhere under a different name, his culinary legacy claimed by others while he remained in hiding. Mount Vernon archives confirm all of this. Hercules existed. Hercules cooked. Hercules shaped American presidential dining, influenced early American cuisine, trained other cooks, but culinary history textbooks barely mention him. Food Network documentaries skip his name. Founding Fathers' food recreations credit Washington's household, not Hercules. And he's not alone. James Hemings, Thomas Jefferson's enslaved chef, trained in French cooking in Paris, brought French culinary techniques to America, made the first French fries served in America, the first ice cream, introduced numerous French dishes to American tables. Jefferson eventually freed Hemings after Hemings trained his replacement. Even freedom came with conditions. Hemings died in 1801, age 36 in Baltimore. His recipes, claimed by Jefferson's family, published without his name. African agricultural knowledge that built American staples. Carolina gold rice didn't grow itself. It came with knowledge. Knowledge that crossed the Atlantic in the minds of people who were stolen from their homes. Rice cultivation in South Carolina and Georgia, which made white plantation owners some of the richest people in North America by the 1750s, was built entirely on West African expertise. Historian Judith Carney's groundbreaking research in her book Black Rice, published in 2001, documents this definitively with agricultural records, rice varieties, and cultivation techniques. Enslaved Africans were selected specifically for their agricultural knowledge. Slave ship manifests note rice country as a desirable origin. Plantation records specify requests for enslaved people from rice-growing regions of West Africa. Carney writes, enslaved Africans were selected for their agricultural skills, not just for generic labor, but for specific, sophisticated knowledge. They knew which rice varieties grew in different water conditions, brackish, fresh, tidal, knew the tidal irrigation systems, the timing of planting and flooding, knew when to harvest based on grain development, not calendar dates, knew how to thresh using traditional African tools, the fanner basket, specific to rice processing, knew how to winnow, to sort, to store. They built the entire Carolina rice economy from memory and expertise. No written instructions, no agricultural manuals, just knowledge maintained across the Middle Passage, across forced labor, across systematic attempts to erase their humanity. And white plantation owners got rich from that knowledge. Henry Lawrence, president of the Continental Congress, founding father, built his fortune on rice grown using enslaved expertise. Charles Pinckney, another founding father and author of parts of the Constitution, same story. They became some of the wealthiest people in America, built Charleston mansions, sent children to Europe for education, funded the American Revolution, all on expertise they didn't develop, couldn't replicate without enslaved labor, and never compensated. The rice made them rich. The people who knew how to grow it stayed enslaved. Barbecue methods. When you say Southern barbecue, when you talk about authentic pit cooking, when you describe traditional techniques, you're really talking about enslaved pitmasters who perfected these methods and never got the branding deal, never got the restaurant chains, never got their names on sauce bottles. Slow pit cooking, whole animal roasting. These come from African traditions. Whole animal roasting was practiced across West and Central Africa, blended with Caribbean barbacoa, the Spanish word that gave us barbecue, which itself came from indigenous Taino cooking methods. Food historian Adrian Miller, his book Black Smoke, African Americans and the United States of Barbecue from 2021, documents how black pitmasters dominated Southern barbecue from slavery through the 20th century. Miller writes, "Black pitmasters dominated Southern barbecue for generations, developing regional styles, creating signature techniques, building reputations that extended far beyond their own communities. They understood fire management, how to build a fire that would burn for 12, 14, 18 hours without temperature spikes, understood wood selection, hickory for pork in the Carolinas, oak in Texas, cherry or apple for poultry, mesquite for beef, each wood creating different smoke, different flavor profiles. They understood temperature control without thermometers, reading smoke color, meat texture, smell, knew when to add wood, when to let it burn down, when to adjust ventilation, understood time in a way that couldn't be rushed, couldn't be scheduled, had to be felt. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved people became professional pitmasters, opened restaurants, built reputations that drew customers from miles away, created regional barbecue styles that still exist. Carolina pulled pork with vinegar sauce, Memphis dry rub, Texas brisket traditions, all developed or refined by black pitmasters. But when barbecue got commercialized in the mid-20th century, when chains started opening, when it became big business with corporate investment and franchise opportunities, their expertise got separated from their identity. The technique stayed, the credit didn't. Now you can get barbecue at chains that make millions. The pitmasters, often still black, still underpaid, still uncredited in the marketing that sells their skills. Frying and oil techniques. Deep frying was widely practiced in West Africa for centuries. Scottish frying existed. They fried fish, sometimes chicken, often in animal fats. But African oil-heavy frying traditions, the specific techniques that make Southern fried chicken what it is, that's what crossed the Atlantic with enslaved Africans. Michael Twitty, culinary historian, author of The Cooking Gene, A Journey Through African American Culinary History from 2017, writes, "The frying traditions crossed the Atlantic in the knowledge and practice of enslaved Africans, not in recipes, not in written form, but in embodied knowledge, in techniques practiced and refined. The technique that makes fried chicken American, heavy oil, high heat, seasoned coating that becomes a crust. That's not Scottish. That's West African technique adapted to American ingredients, chickens instead of guinea fowl, wheat flour instead of other grain coatings, but the fundamental method is African. Enslaved cooks perfected it, made it with chicken because chickens were often the only livestock enslaved people were allowed to raise themselves. Chickens didn't require much space, could forage, could be kept without enslaver permission in some places. They turned survival cooking, making do with what you could raise yourself, into something extraordinary, into a technique so refined that it became an American icon, a national dish, a symbol of Southern identity. And fried chicken became, for a time in the early 20th century, associated with black entrepreneurship. Black-owned restaurants serving fried chicken, particularly in urban areas after the Great Migration. Gordonsville, Virginia became famous for black women selling fried chicken to trained passengers, the waiter carriers who built businesses around their cooking skills. But then came commercialization, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Popeyes, churches, chains built on techniques perfected by black cooks, marketed with vague Southern imagery, profiting from expertise they didn't develop. KFC makes over $20 billion annually. Popeyes over $4 billion. The descendants of the people who perfected the technique, often working minimum wage in those same chains, cooking food their ancestors invented, uncredited and undercompensated. Okra, gumbo, and stews. Okra came from West Africa. The word gumbo comes from keen gombo, the Bantu word for okra. The dish itself is named after an African ingredient using African cooking techniques, and somehow that origin gets minimized in culinary histories. Louisiana Creole food, gumbo, jambalaya, etouffee, dirty rice, evolved from West African cooking techniques meeting indigenous American ingredients, meeting French culinary traditions, meeting Spanish influences. It's genuinely multicultural, but the foundation is African. The roux technique, flour toasted in fat until it darkens, creates complexity, adds depth. That comes from French cooking, yes. But the way it's used in gumbo, the timing, the color preference, that's adapted through African cooking knowledge. The okra as thickener, African. The file powder from indigenous Choctaw people, Native American contribution. The layered seasoning, the trinity of onions, celery, and bell peppers, that's French mirepoix adapted to local vegetables. The rice it's served over, African cultivation knowledge. That's cultural synthesis. But the expertise that made it work, that balanced these elements, that created something greater than the sum of its parts, that came from enslaved cooks who couldn't write down their recipes, couldn't claim ownership, couldn't profit from their innovations. And when white cookbook authors published Louisiana recipes in the 1800s and early 1900s, like the Picayune's Creole Cookbook from 1901, they documented the food meticulously, ingredients, proportions, timing. But they didn't name the cooks. The recipes became traditional Louisiana cooking, authentic Creole cuisine, without acknowledging whose traditions, whose authenticity. The food survived, the names didn't. That's not accident, that's the system working exactly as designed. The cookbook problem. The recipes were written down, the authors weren't. 19th century American cookbooks credited white plantation mistresses as authors. Mary Randolph's The Virginia Housewife in 1824, one of the most influential American cookbooks ever published. Sarah Rutledge's The Carolina Housewife in 1847. Lettice Bryant's The Kentucky Housewife in 1839. Housekeeping in Old Virginia in 1879. Written by Marion Harland, but compiled by many white Southern women. But who was actually cooking in these kitchens? Who developed these recipes over years of daily practice? Who perfected these techniques, tested these proportions, created these dishes? Enslaved cooks who couldn't publish because they legally couldn't read or write. Most Southern states made teaching enslaved people to read a criminal offense punishable by whipping or imprisonment. Who couldn't own intellectual property because they couldn't legally own anything. Property cannot own property. Who couldn't sign their names to their work because their names weren't considered their own. Enslaved people could be renamed at will. The cookbook problem is elegant and brutal. Knowledge was extracted through daily labor. Recipes were documented by women who supervised but rarely cooked. Credit was reassigned through publication and copyright law. Profit went to people who didn't create the food. All of it legal. All of it normalized. All of it structured into the system so thoroughly that questioning it seemed absurd. Post-emancipation rebranding. After emancipation, many black cooks continued in domestic service. It was the work they knew, the expertise they developed, the skill they could market. But now they could be paid, could leave abusive situations, could negotiate terms. Limited freedom, but freedom nonetheless. And Southern cooking began to be marketed nationally in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Became American cuisine, a symbol of regional pride, a nostalgic connection to a pre-industrial past. Cookbooks marketed nationwide. Restaurants opened in northern cities. Food manufacturers created Southern-style products. But the black origin systematically minimized, actively erased, deliberately rebranded as traditional Southern without mentioning who created the traditions, who refined the techniques, who built the cuisine. Scholar Psyche Williams-Forson writes about this cultural food politics in her work Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, how food that was created by black people for survival, perfected by black people through expertise, became commercialized by white people for profit, while black contributions got erased. The pattern is consistent. Acknowledge Southern heritage without specifying who's South, whose heritage. Credit traditional methods without naming who established the tradition. Market authentic cuisine while erasing the actual authors. The food survived, the techniques survived, the flavor survived, the names didn't, the credit did, the compensation didn't. That's not accident or oversight. That's a system designed to extract value while denying origin. Economic power without ownership. After the Civil War, black caterers in cities like Philadelphia and New Orleans didn't just run businesses. They influenced American banquet culture, set standards for elite dining, catered to high society. Robert Bogle in Philadelphia, called the father of American catering, Catering, started his business in the 1820s while still navigating limited freedom as a black man in the North, built a catering empire, served Philadelphia's elite, trained numerous other black caterers who went on to run their own successful businesses. Peter Augustine in New Orleans, Tunis G. Campbell in New York, James Wormley in Washington, D.C. Black caterers who ran businesses, hired employees, built reputations, influenced American food culture in the 19th century. They had economic power within constraints, could build wealth, could pass businesses to children, could employ community members, but still faced discrimination, still operated in a racist society, still had their contributions minimized in broader histories. Fried chicken, the dish black cooks perfected, became an American icon through a specific pattern. Black people created it, black people sold it, white people commercialized it, corporations profited from it. Then came Colonel Sanders and Kentucky Fried Chicken in the 1950s. Harlan Sanders didn't invent fried chicken, didn't invent the technique, didn't even invent franchising fried chicken. Black-owned fried chicken restaurants existed for decades before KFC, but Sanders had access to capital, to franchising knowledge, to white business networks, built an empire using techniques black cooks perfected, made billions using their expertise, became globally synonymous with American fried chicken, while the people who created the dish often working minimum wage in those same restaurants, cooking food their ancestors invented. You can't copyright a recipe when you can't legally read. Literacy laws during slavery made teaching enslaved people to read illegal in most southern states after the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831. Virginia law, up to 20 lashes for any enslaved person caught reading. North Carolina, fine for any white person teaching enslaved people to read. The laws were explicit, the punishment severe, the message clear. Legal inability to own property meant legal inability to own intellectual property, can't trademark a recipe, can't copyright a technique, can't claim ownership of innovation. Property cannot own property. The logic was circular and absolute, and cultural appropriation through power imbalance did the rest. Even after emancipation, even when literacy became possible, the power to publish, to market, to commercialize remained in white hands. American cuisine isn't stolen in flavor. The food itself is multicultural, legitimately blended. It's stolen in credit. The foundation is African, African-American, indigenous, and immigrant. The techniques were developed by enslaved people. The expertise came from forced labor, and the profit, that went elsewhere. That still goes elsewhere. This isn't past tense. The pattern continues. Celebrity chefs discovering techniques black cooks have used for centuries. Food media praising innovative combinations that are standard in black Southern cooking. Cookbooks marketed as elevating soul food, as if it needed elevation, as if it wasn't already sophisticated. Restaurants charging $40 for oxtails that black families have been cooking for generations. Artisan fried chicken at $28 a plate using techniques unchanged from 1850. Heritage grits for $12 a bowl when grits have always been this good. You just weren't paying attention. The food survived. The techniques survived. The flavors survived. The names didn't. Every time you eat Southern food, you're eating recipes perfected by people who couldn't own them. Every time you see traditional or heritage or authentic on a menu, ask, whose tradition? Whose heritage? Whose definition of authentic? Who profits from this authenticity? Hercules escaped slavery, but not anonymity. James Hemings won freedom, but not credit. Thousands of unnamed enslaved cooks created American cuisine, and history recorded them as property, not as chefs, not as innovators, not as people. The least we can do is tell the truth about who built this cuisine. The most we can do is restructure who profits from it. Somewhere between those two is the work.